The communists, as Marx talks about them, are the people who are doing basically what Marx is trying to do. That is, say, they're the people who are trying to organize the proletariat, to unify the proletariat, to help them kind of take over political power from the bourgeoisie. And so Marx spends some time in the Communist Manifesto talking about what the communists in particular are trying to do. And the communists in particular are the people like Marx who see this struggle between the working class and then the owners of the means of production, and who side with the working class and are working to organize the working class to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Something like that. That's the communists. And Marx very clearly identifies himself with the communists. Now, in the second section of the Communist Manifesto, Marx turns his attention to describing what it is communists are trying to do, what their aim is, what their goal is. And in Marx's view, he's very clear about this. Right, there are lots of things that communists are trying to do, but the kind of overarching unifying goal that they have is to abolish private property. The abolition of private property, that is the goal of the communists. And this is a fairly famous statement of Marx's. It is a fairly widely misunderstood statement of Marx's. When people see this claim, Marx and the communists are trying to abolish private property, they immediately think, and this is what it sounds like. I mean, so it's not they're not totally blameworthy for thinking this, but a lot of people immediately think, oh, the communists, people like Marx, they just want to take all your stuff. That's not true. Marx is fairly clear about this. When he mentions private property in this context, he does not mean personal property. Personal property does not count as private property. Marx and the communists are not trying to abolish personal property. Personal property are going to be things like, I don't know, the stuff at your house, basically. The stuff you own, your stuff, right? Your clothes, your books, whatever, your pots and pans, your lamps, your furniture, bed, whatever, all that you'd like, your stuff that you use and make use of as you live. Those are your personal belongings. Marx is not trying to abolish that. The communists are not trying to say, yeah, you can't have any of that stuff. Nobody has any books. The books are for everybody. Or we have a communal store of clothes and you don't get to have your own or whatever. That's not the idea. Marx, at least here, right, in the communists, in Marx's view, not saying anything like that. So then what do they mean by private property? Marx, when he uses the phrase private property, he means private or bourgeois property. Sometimes they'll just call it bourgeois property. And what he means by that is ownership, private ownership of the means of production, of capital, of productive property. That's what he means. Means of production, capital, productive property. That's factories, machines, things like that, right? It's property that you can use to produce stuff, to make other things. That's what factories are. There's something that's owned, a factory is, right? And they have the machines and everything in there. That's a certain kind of property that's productive. It can be used to make more things. And it's privately owned. In a capitalistic economy, productive property is privately owned. And the key contrast here, private versus public, is not, companies that are publicly traded are still going to be private in this sense. The sense of public that Marx would be interested in this context is governmentally owned, something like that. or owned by everyone, not just some group of people, right? So publicly traded companies, you know, like Facebook or whatever, are still privately owned in Marx's sense, right? Ford, publicly traded company, it's still privately owned. It's owned by the shareholders, the people who own Ford stock. That's still private ownership of productive property. That's got to be abolished, right? So as it stands, factories and machines and productive property more generally is owned by particular individuals, maybe groups of particular individuals, but particular individuals nonetheless. It's not owned publicly. It's not owned by the state. And what the goal of the communists is to abolish private ownership of productive property. And so all factories, all productive property will become the property of the state. The state will come to own all this stuff. And this is a little bit misleading because Marx actually thinks the state will go away, which we'll get to. The state will go away if we have the communist revolution and so on. But that's the goal, the abolition of that kind of property. No one can own the means of production any longer. That's what they're striving for. Now, how are they going to achieve this? Marx gets very practical, more practical than most of the people that we have read this semester. Marx gets very, very practical. And what he says here has had tremendous influence on the 20th century, immeasurable influence on the political happenings of the 20th century. And so oftentimes people talk about how philosophy, you know, it's just kind of people talking with their heads in the clouds, you know, political philosophy, social philosophy, whatever. And, you know, and it's all abstract. And what does it have to do with real life? What does philosophy have to do with real life? It's just these big, huge questions and ideas. Doesn't have any real world impact. It doesn't really do anything. It's just kind of useless and impractical. That could not be farther from the truth. While philosophy might not affect things tomorrow, it doesn't affect things in the immediate short term. The impact that it has in the long run on the big picture is it's impossible to underestimate. And Marx's Communist Manifesto is perhaps the best illustration of something like that, right? We have this philosophical, political, theoretical work that has just totally changed the course of human history, even just in the past 100 years. Right. And so in this second part of the Communist Manifesto, the second section, Marx gets very practical and he starts outlining the ways in which some of the policies and so on, that the ways that the communists will achieve their goals, and these kind of recommendations for policies, these ways to achieve the communist goal, have been hugely impactful on the 20th century and following. So first, how are we going to do it? So imagine you're Marx, you're trying to organize people, you're trying to organize the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie. How do we do that? Well, the first step, Marx says, is to win the battle of democracy and then install the proletariat as the ruling class. Something interesting about this. Given Marx's reputation, you would think that the first step is going to be revolution. That's not the way he puts the point, however. He doesn't put the point merely in terms of revolution. He puts it in terms of winning the battle of democracy. And so that makes it really look like, one way to achieve these goals, to bring about a communist society, it's not through revolution, but through the ballot box, so to speak. And what he really seems to be emphasizing here is that what we need to do is organize workers so that they will vote for other workers, so that they will vote for people who will represent the proletariat's interest. And so the main idea here with winning the battle of democracy is that the proletariat needs to acquire ruling power. Right now, it's exclusively in the hands of the bourgeois, according to Marx. I think he'd say the same thing about today. Political power is in the hands of the bourgeois, and it is used in almost every circumstance to advance the interests of the bourgeois. Political scientists have done analyses on these kinds of things. There was just one from a guy, I can't remember the names. It's a guy from Northwestern, a guy from Columbia, maybe 5-10 years ago. They looked at policies that were considered in Congress, and they looked at, in particular, those policies where corporate interest and lobbying diverged from public interest and public opinion. So the corporations or very rich people approved, say, of the policy, whereas the public at large disapproved, or vice versa. And these political scientists looked at a bunch of policies like that, and they looked to see, which way does the bill get passed? Does the policy get approved, or does it get shot down? And does the Congress end up going with the people, or do they end up going with these corporate interests? And overwhelmingly, they go with what they found was that the Congress would side with the richer interests, the corporate interests, right? And so when the public at large disapproved of a plan, but the corporations affected approved of it, Congress would approve the plan, right? That would be a sign, Marx would say, or a communist would say, that political power is entirely in the hands of the bourgeoisie. And what we need to do is wrest that away from the bourgeoisie and give it to the proletariat. Right? And whether that's through winning the battle of democracy, which is what he stressed here, or revolution, what's important, according to Marx, is that the proletariat becomes the ruling class. Now, maybe that happens through revolution, right? Marx isn't saying that that's impossible or a bad idea necessarily, but he does stress winning the battle of democracy, right? So that's going to be the first thing that they do. And that's going to usher in this initial stage of communist society that Marx sometimes calls the dictatorship of the proletariat. What the proletariat will do to achieve the goal of the communists, to achieve a communist society, is once they have this political power, they will use it in a somewhat dictatorial manner. They're going to use it to take away all productive property from the bourgeoisie. They're going to use it to more or less confiscate, to take property away from the bourgeoisie. That's what they'll use their political power to do. And Marx is clear. He's direct about this. This is going to involve making serious inroads against the so-called right to property. We're going to, quote unquote, violate that right. Now, Marx doesn't think that's a legitimate right, and so doesn't think that there's anything wrong with this. But he realizes, and he's forthright about this, that this is going to look something like a dictatorship. It's going to be the proletariat using power in a dictatorial manner, right? And just taking things from the bourgeoisie, right? And this is going to lead to the abolishment of private property. This kind of these two stages of achieving the goals of the communist, hugely influential. This has formed the thinking of people like Mao and Lenin, was highly influential on the communist revolutions in China and in Russia and Cambodia. And you can see, if you look at the history of those countries and the ways the revolutions unfolded, you could see something like this. There were changes. So Leninism had to affect a certain kind of change. The proletariat wasn't organizing on its own right. And so Lenin came up with this idea of a kind of vanguard party. People would, so people like Lenin and the other Soviet communists would kind of carry out the revolution on behalf of the proletariat. There'd be this vanguard party that would carry it out on their behalf and exercise political power on their behalf and so on. And one of the things that you see in the 20s, 30s, the USSR was using political power to wrest capital away from people who had it, to take away productive property from people who owned it. One particularly clear example of this is called, it's referred to as the dekulakization that the Soviet Union went through, and you can look that up in greater detail if you like. But that was, in many ways, simply it was motivated by this desire to take away capital, productive property, from people who had it. In this case, it was these people called the kulaks. They were kind of prosperous farmers. And the Soviet Union made inroads against their property, right, on behalf of the proletariat to affect the goal of the communists and so on. Marx gets even more specific, and he lists 10 policies that the communists will have, that the proletariat should enforce or accept, adopt when they acquire this political power. I'm not going to go through them all. This list of policies has been enormously influential. This list of policies you can see cropping up all over politics in the 20th century. And so a lot of these policies have informed certain goals or aspirations of what might be called the left in American politics, or progressivism in American politics. For example, look down at number 10, abolishing child labor, ensuring free education for all children in public schools. That might just seem like, well, a matter of course now, but that was something that had to be fought for. And it was fought for by progressives. And you kind of see this, you see it coming out of Marx in certain ways. Heavy progressive income tax, a similar kind of thing. That's something that's been adopted. Some people argue not heavy enough, but it's something that's been adopted in the United States and in just about every developed economy. Right? And so there are certain things going on in these policies that have struck a lot of people, not just communists, but a lot of people as positive and as worthwhile. At the same time, some of these policies have had absolutely disastrous effects when there have been attempts to put them into power or put them into place. So, for example, if you look at number 9 in particular, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. And this is related to this. We saw Marx talking about this earlier, the fact that cities had become centralized. Workers had been fleeing the rural lands and been centralizing in cities. This was a bad thing. And a lot of communist countries saw this as a bad thing. And there was a kind of forced migration of people from cities back into the farmlands. And this kind of goes with 9. One of the things that they would try to do is have farmers who would also engage in manufacture or in kind of industry in some way. And so, for example, in China's, I believe it was in the Great Leap Forward, they had farmers set up kind of steel, I can't remember what they're called, but kind of steel ovens on their farms or in their areas, right? It wasn't centralized in a central steel manufacturing facility. They tried to have these collective farms do it. In part because they were taking these policies from the Communist Manifesto very seriously. The Great Leap Forward ended up being an nearly unmitigated economic disaster. It led to one of the worst famines that human beings have ever experienced. The estimates of how many people have died is it ranges considerably, but it ranges from, I think, 20 million upwards to 50 million, right? So tens of millions of people died because of certain economic policies that seem to be derived. So you can look this up more in the Great Leap Forward. You can go look up the Great Leap Forward and read about it. But these policies seem to have a rather direct connection. Some policies such as the Great Leap Forward or dekulakization, or if you consider the policies of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where some 1 to 2 million people died. There was a similar kind of thing, forcing people back out into forcing city dwellers back out into the farmlands, and an ensuing famine. If you look at these policies that these various countries put into effect, they're clearly derived or inspired by the kinds of things you see here in the Communist Manifesto, and they had absolutely devastating human consequences. And so what you get here in Marx and in the Communist Manifesto is perhaps a vision of something that you might find appealing, but it's a bit of a mixed bag. Historically, these policies, really, it's hard to tens and tens of millions of people died because of these policies. It's hard to overstate how awful some of them really were. And it's not really that much a matter of controversy as to what caused these things. The Communist Party itself of China was fairly well aware that the reason for this famine, it wasn't just bad luck or misfortune. They were fairly certain that it was the economic policies that were put into place. And so what we have here with Marx is something incredibly interesting, but also that has significant danger and risks involved with it. But that's not a reason not to read it, of course. It's a reason all the more to read it, which is one of the reasons why we're covering it.